آزادی بیان
言论自由
free speech.
Dunja Mijatović, thank you very much for talking to us. You've been the OSCE representative for freedom of media since 2010. Has anything in this large Europe got better in that time?
Well, I'm quite optimistic. Probably I will not be able to do this job if I'm not. You have to look at the positive developments, but you also have to be very honest and realistic in doing this job. And unfortunately, the moves by the states recently are not giving too much hope that there is a genuine political will to accept more freedom. And when I say freedom, I'm thinking about freedom of expression and freedom of the media. There are, positive steps. Countries are adopting more laws, access to information. Some countries are decriminalizing libel. So all this is giving hope that they want to move in a positive direction. But when it comes to implementation and actually the real world, and this real world happens when I talk to journalists, we are not really moving in the right direction, I would say.
Yes. Have you been shocked by how fast media freedom has been restricted in countries like Poland and Hungary?
Not really, because in Hungary started some time ago, so actually almost 7 years ago. It started in 2010, and this office has been working on Hungarian legislation, offering recommendations by independent experts, trying to raise the awareness about the importance of democracies leading by example. But what happened at that time, I must say, was not very encouraging. European Commission, in my view, was quite vague in their demands on free expression to be respected by one of the member states. And one of my statements at that time was that this will come back as a boomerang to all of us, not just EU member states, but beyond. And unfortunately, this is the case. When we were raising the issues in Hungary, there was a silence internationally. Others, international organizations, started acting after that.
May I interrupt you there for a moment? Because, forgive me, may I interrupt you for a moment? Because you mentioned the European Commission. It seems to me there is a problem that the Europe of values and rights is located in the Council of Europe and the OSCE, including free speech rights, but the power, particularly the economic power, is located with the European Union, so that, as it were, the European Union has the much larger stick. Is that one of the structural issues for you?
Well, the European Commission is definitely the only organization with a stick, particularly when it comes to candidate and potential candidate countries. So, of course, they have more power to address these issues when it comes to member states. The question is now, how strong are those powers? How acquis and everything that the European Commission had at its disposal can be used when member states are not complying with the values, with fundamental values, as they call it, and all issues of concern. Of course, there were attempts to change something in Hungary, but also by the Council of Europe as well. But all this, in my view, is not sending a strong political signal to other states that this is not going to be tolerated. On the contrary, everything that is happening is very vague. It's very sort of, the countries need to understand, they need to comply with the recommendations. Then you look at the recommendations, the recommendations are not complied with, and nothing happens. And all this is creating an atmosphere and a signal to all other countries within EU, but also outside the EU, that this is something that is going to be tolerated.
So we've now seen an extraordinary clampdown on the media in Turkey, for example. Do you think Turkey has taken any notice of these admonitions coming from Europe?
At this stage, I would say no. I would say that because of many other issues that are much broader and much more complex than just media freedom and free speech in Turkey, are actually making the life of all of us fighting for more freedom and for free speech and media freedom more complicated. The thing is, in order to raise the issues of free speech and freedom of expression, you need to look at the broader picture. Of course, you cannot just, look at particular cases. And it is a case that there was an attempted military coup in Turkey. And it is the case that Turkey has right and should make certain steps in order to investigate what actually happened and to prosecute, people that were doing something that is not allowed in democracy. But the problems with media freedom and free speech in Turkey now goes way back from this time. And what we have at the moment is more than 140 journalists in prison, more than 150 media outlets shut down. And we also have to be realistic. There are terrorist attacks constantly. The recent one on Saturday, which is terrifying. Again, innocent people are killed. But all this is not giving hope that Turkish government is recognizing the importance of free speech and journalism. Even in times of crisis, journalists need to report. They need to challenge the government. They need to inform society on what is happening. And at the moment, Turkish government is really not listening to anybody when it comes to this. There is a state of emergency. But I would say there is a state of emergency in France, but journalists are not arrested, not to mention academics and writers.
Let me, if I may, take you to, I don't know if you've got them to hand, to one or two of the principles around which we have organized the Free Speech Debate Project, starting with the one on violence, which is we neither make threats of violence nor accept violent intimidation. Do you believe that what I have called the assassin's veto, closing down speech by threats of violence and then making that credible, such as in the Charlie Hebdo killings, is a growing threat to freedom of the media in Europe at the moment?
Absolutely. I agree with this. This was one of the issues my office has been raising for a very long period of time. My view after Charlie Hebdo was quite direct, and it is that the violence against speech of any kind is totally not accepted. There is a red line there. Violence is something that actually is not acceptable in democracies. It is not acceptable in general. People losing their lives because of their views, of their cartoons or their writing is something that we should never accept in our societies. And the threat is visible, it is there. The whole Europe, the situation when it comes to free speech changed tremendously after Charlie Hebdo. But what I was very afraid of and what I was very stunned with were statements by some, saying, that they were killed, it's terrible, but in my view, there is no but. That absolutely this but does not exist. And this is something we need to continue repeating and making sure that the voices are heard in these discussions that are not accepting this, but, they were unacceptable, vulgar, provocative, or whatever, which is a part of modern democratic society. It is actually the price you have to pay for living in democracy.
I mean, of course, I 100% agree with that, but in one of your recommendations for social media, you said no one should be penalized for social media activities, such as posting and direct messaging, unless they can be directly connected to violent actions and satisfy the test of imminent lawless action. Now, some people would say, isn't the lesson from Bosnia, from your own homeland precisely, that there are certain kinds of hate speech which, while they're not directly threatening imminent violence, as it were, a part of the food chain that leads to violence? In other words, isn't there a really serious question about where we draw that line?
Even coming from Bosnia and experiencing, this, what you just described, different kind of, call it hate speech or unacceptable or dangerous speech, I still think more speech is a key. I do not think, restrictions can bring any benefits to the society, particularly in a post-war environment. I mean, post-war, 20 years after the war, we have to accept the views that, and then only then we can challenge those views. For me, red line is really, calls for violence. I spent part of my career working for regulatory agency, media regulatory agency that was fighting hate speech. Part of my career was dedicated to shutting down the stations. But if you look at the cases, they were related to stations using radio waves and calling for stoning people in front of the municipality. That is not free speech. That is a criminal act.
That's a specific example from Bosnia, is it? Could you tell us which station was that?
Sorry?
Which station, which radio was it?
Radio Bratunac at that time.
Right. What period were we talking about then?
Exactly, I think it was just maybe 98, 99. Right. But I can find the decision.
Right, but this was direct incitement. So let me take it from the other side, because all of us now, including free speech debate, are on the search for effective counter-speech online. I mean, that's one of the great challenges.
Absolutely.
What does your experience tell you? Can you point to certain really positive examples of effective counter-speech?
I mean, there are many positive examples of giving people a platform to discuss painful, full of tensions. This is what we do with this project. My office started 2 years ago, bringing together Ukrainian and Russian journalists.
Tell us about that, yes.
In a very difficult time. Of course, it's, many are saying this is mission impossible, but I do not think so. Maybe it's not accomplished, but it is possible as long as people are willing to talk. And it started as a platform of people that came, full of emotions and tensions, having very heavy discussions. But then after a while, they could find ways to talk about journalism. And one of their trips to Sarajevo recently to talk to reporters from all sides that were reporting during the war and after the war in Bosnia. They were sort of also brought into the environment to realize that there is a need to talk and to discuss things. And there are many initiatives internationally. I mean, your project is one of the initiatives where you have people discussing topics without being told this is allowed or this is not allowed. But in my personal experience from my home country, and all the work I dedicated to free speech and free media and journalism in general is just proving to me that restrictions are not the way out when it comes to free speech or freedom of the media at all.
Can I just jump in there? This was Russian and Ukrainian journalists actually meeting each other in person, right? So it seems to me plausible to argue that there's a qualitative leap from the merely virtual interaction to one where you're actually meeting face to face and going off to have a drink and so
Yes.
on. And do you think that is, in your experience, do you think that's right, that it really, there's no substitute for getting actual people together?
Yeah, I mean that is actually the key in any relations. I mean you need people to sit and to confront each other and to have discussions. What is happening, which we also have to recognize, that there is a lot of discussions and conversation now in 21st century going on in cyberspace, and this is something we need to accept. We need to do more when it comes to internet and media literacy. I think we are failing. It is extremely important what you do and what many other academics are doing. I think academia plays an important, extremely important role in this. This is not just in relation to the governments. This is not something that is only for the governments and international organizations to take care of. It is extremely important to have access to young people and to talk to them. But when it comes to social media, I also think we need to recognize these newcomers. We need to accept bloggers, social media activists. Many people are afraid of it. Many people, think this is something that is going to destroy journalism. I do not think so. What I agree with is that we are still tapping in a dark or maybe some kind of gray zone, and we need to do more. But I do not think that the restrictions can bring any success.
Let me take you to something which justifies an awful lot. Well, I say justifies, is quoted to justify a lot of restrictions on free speech. So our principle on secrecy reads, we must be empowered to challenge all limits to freedom of information justified on such grounds as national security.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite obvious that an awful lot of limits, particularly in European democracies, are justified in the name of security. Mm-hmm. Would you say that is something which has, in some sense, got worse over the last 10 to 15 years in the context of so many terrorist attacks?
It actually worsened, in my view, last 5 years. It started quite some time ago. And of course, there is a threat that we need to recognize. That threat is real. People need to live in a safe societies. Governments, they have a legitimate right to make sure that we are safe. But what I see, and it's based on facts, it's based on laws that my office is monitoring. Now it seems to me that everything is allowed in the name of security. And in this process, even the well-established democracies are putting human rights under the carpet.
So, for example, the so-called the new Investigative Powers Act in Britain, sometimes
that's
called...
one of the interventions I had. I wrote a letter to UK government on this and many other issues, particularly looking at the protection of sources in digital age, which protection of sources of journalists, which I think it's a very important article of this law. I also ask for judicial oversight because I do recognize as the OSCE representative on freedom of the media that there are situations where there is a need for a proper based on a rule of law process in order to investigate certain things. But I do not think this should be done without judicial oversight. Right. So this was the main point, and it's not just this law. There are many other laws in many other countries. Recently I had to raise a law in Germany. Before that there was France, blocking websites without judicial oversight. And you ask yourself as a free speech advocate or the OSCE official, if this is something that democracies are doing, what can I expect and how can you raise the issues with the countries that are on the way to democracy or the countries that will never become democracy? The way we see it in a Western world. And all this is creating a very unstable situation for journalists, for citizens, for journalism in general, and journalists are somehow, and this is based on my talks with them, sometimes because of these laws they feel like certain spies.
Yes.
So they look, for encryption, they look for other ways in order to protect the sources, which is a sacred part of journalism. And in this sort of, age nowadays, it becomes extremely vulnerable and problematic.
Indeed, I know journalists who complain about that they're having to operate like spies and the military level encryption to protect their sources.
Yes.
So in short, your sense is that we're probably getting the balance between security and freedom of media in the wrong place in Western democracies at the moment.
Yeah, I would say so. And it's not just Western democracies, all over the world.
Yes, but as you said, Western democracies, as it were, set an example which others can quote and follow.
Absolutely. I mean, democracies, and I still feel very strongly about this, democracies should lead by example. I used in my previous, professional life, UK, United States, many other countries as a leading examples, telling, countries in a part of the world where I come from, the Balkans, Middle East, this is how it should be. This is, Norway, of course, Scandinavian countries as well. So in my work, I use this as an example by saying, this is how it should be, and this is, how you feel as a journalist, and how you can do your job without restrictions, and feel, that the country, that the state is going to protect you. Nowadays, this is not really the case. I just hope this is just a period we all have to go through, so we will go back to the time where journalism was more respected and more safe to perform. But we have to go through this process, and through this process, to go, we need to be very loud and clear, defending free speech and free media.
Can you recall a particular conversation in an authoritarian regime, for example, in Russia or Kazakhstan, where, or maybe there are many examples, where what the Western democracies are doing was quoted against you?
Oh, yes.
Does that happen all the time?
It had to be, that totalitarian. It happened in Macedonia, and I was told why I'm pushing, for certain laws to be adopted, why I'm pushing for certain articles to be changed based on international standards, when Hungary just did everything opposite, and this is allowed.
Yeah.
Of course, I do not accept this kind of arguing or reasoning, but this is happening most of the times, and it's not just a conversation that I have with different authorities and different regimes. It is something that you hear from time to time in the media, and this is something that is quite worrying. I know that all of us working in the area of free speech, including the UN Rapporteur on Free Expression, Human Rights Commissioner, the Council of Europe, and many other colleagues are facing similar situations.
Yes. Now, our principle on journalism says we require uncensored, diverse, trustworthy media. One of the great themes of the last year has been the so-called post-fact society or post-truth society. Do you regard that as the major challenge that you have to address as a representative on freedom of media?
Not really. I think, that there is some kind of hysteria in relation to this, fake news, post-fact, Oxford suddenly, has this as a word of the year. To me, it's quite it's really not remarkable that people lie. I think lies existed before. There were fake stories, disinformation. propaganda. Why suddenly, this is a topic and we are suddenly discovering that there are websites or papers that are spreading lies. There are governments saying they are going to fix it, they are going to restrict it, they are going to, do everything in order to stop this because people are, not getting the right information. Instead of really, focusing on, putting more funds into public service broadcasting, literacy, and all this. I tried to tackle it just last week. I issued a communique in relation to criminalization of speech, on social media platforms. But that's just one angle, and then I'm planning to have a joint declaration with other rapporteurs, African American and UN rapporteur, particularly on these phenomena. But not, in order to find a formula how to tackle fake news, but to warn about the attempts of the governments to meddle in order to, start using this topic as a way to, put more restrictions.
But let me push you on that, because I take your point, but the use of bots, for example, allegedly Russia has been using bots on a very large scale to multiply the number of false stories coming through social media. Don't you think that's a proper subject of concern?
Yeah, that is absolute, but that I do not consider, free media issue at all. I think this is something that is part of also information security. So my office is not engaged in this particular issue. We see it as something that we of course follow, but I do not see this as a part of free speech debate.
Right. Final question. What is the single achievement you're proudest of as OSCE representative on freedom of media?
I mean, it's very sort of basic human feeling that is not really visible or anything, but just how I feel about it. It's the fact that I managed to help individuals to get out of prison, many, that I managed to help some people performing journalism in a very difficult situations. That I managed to reach out to the governments that were not willing to talk to. So it's reaching out, if you would say, like a single sort of thing. And I don't think in this post you can perform miracles. But I managed to sort of bring office in a limelight, if I can say so, because it was quite hidden in international arena, as a place where journalists can seek help. So more or less, I think I'm extremely humble in this, but I'm very happy with the achievement of this small office internationally. But then again, what I said to you at the very beginning of this last statement is, helping people. That's the main thing.
So in a way, the deepest satisfaction is actually getting journalists out of jail.
Yeah, jail. Helping them. In the processes where I was seeking for the charges to be dropped by governments that were chasing them. So that's something that really fills you with pride, and you feel like you're worth whatever you're doing. But in general, I cannot change. You cannot, as a representative, change political environment. That is also not my role. But the way I use my voice, I think I'm extremely pleased with it. I think I was very loud and clear, not really diplomatic. But I think this helped a lot, and in order for this office to be recognized by civil society as a place to come and to complain when they have problems.
Dunja Mijatović, thank you very much for talking loudly and clearly to a free speech debate.
Thank you so much, Timothy. Real honor. Thank you.
Very nice to talk to you.
آزادی بیان.
言论自由.
Free speech.